Hey guys, another vinyl video, and we're still with Cannibal Corpse. So moving on, we have their next album in the catalog, and that is Bloodthirst. This is their first album they did in their career up to this point that was recorded in a studio other than Morrisound. Because Scott Burns and Morrisound, around this time, the end of the 90s, that producer Scott Burns, he was kind of tired of producing records. To be honest, he wanted to do something else with his life, and so they stopped really having like quality stuff at Morrisound after that. Before that, all the Florida bands and really most of like the death metal bands and thrash bands that were borderline thrash death metal all recorded with Scott Burns at Morrisound Studios. It was the place to record at. Kind of like how Eric Rutan from Cannibal Corpse, Hate Eternal, Morbid Angel. He's the current death metal dude for recording, as well as Peter Tatgren from Hypocrisy. He is also another big name in the industry for putting out good death metal and black metal records up in Sweden there at Abyss Studios. And another one that's popular is the guy that produced Dimmu Borgir for their biggest, arguably commercially successful albums, is Studio Fredman up in Sweden as well. Fredrik Nordstom's studio. Anyway, so yeah, this is Bloodthirst, and I actually saw the band live twice during this album's touring cycle. The first time was in 2000. Both times were in Toronto, by the way, in Canada. The first show I saw them with was with Christian and The Crown. And I had heard Christian and The Crown from the samplers that were included with Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, which I read that magazine like every month, like without fail. I was buying it, and it came with a new sampler CD every month with new tunes. This was before the internet got big, and it was a really good source for getting turned on to new metal bands. So I went to go see them, and up until that point, like I've always, when I go to a show, if I have my choice and I buy the tickets, I always am in the mosh pit on the floor. I don't know that that would be the case now, but back then when I was going to shows all the time, that's where I was. I wanted to be right up as close as I could be with the band and seeing them so close that I could see the notes the guitarists were playing on their instruments, and yeah, I could make eye contact with the band members while they were performing if I chose to, and that's what it was. So the mosh pit for that show was so crazy that when I came out of the show at the end, they had big, thick steel guardrails in between the mosh pit and the stage where the band was, and at the end, like the steel of like the barricade was folded up so much from like the pressure of people pushing and moshing and being crazy in the mosh pit that it looked like a deformed tuna can lid. That ought to give you an idea of how insane it was. And there were like girls that were in there brought by their boyfriends that were getting crushed and like crying to be let out and stuff. There was a girl right in front of me. Security had to like grab her and lift her up and out of the mosh pit because she was crying because of how intense and crazy it was. She was getting crushed. That kind of sucked. I was there with a buddy of mine who was the bass player in my band at the time, and he saw that and thought it was brutal too. And when we were outside the venue getting something to eat and waiting for our bus to come back home from Toronto, somebody shot at us while we were out in front of the Pizza there on Queen Street. So that was nice, having some random person like shoot at us. Lovely. So here's the vinyl for the album, since I already showed you the covers. There's side A, and here's side B. It also comes with an insert and a bonus two-sided poster. So here's the insert. And the poster on the one side is the album artwork, and I don't know what it is on this. Oh, it's the alternate vinyl cover on the other side. Or if you had the CD version from back in the day, it's the behind the CD picture that was in the clear jewel case. I had this album on CD years ago when it first came out, before I started collecting vinyl. Honestly, though, I never would have bought CDs if vinyl had never gone away, because it's always been my favorite format. I grew up with my mom having a turntable and vinyl in the house, and I got some early music on vinyl myself. It was my first actual copies of having like a legitimate like copy from the artist. I, of course, like everybody, had numerous cassette dupes of albums during the 80s and 90s, because that's what people did back then. There was no computer, and this was before CDs, and people, you know, I honestly wasn't a fan of buying original cassettes, because cassettes would get munched up in your tape deck, or if you brought it to people's houses or whatever, like the tape inside it would snap from being rewound or fast forwarded or paused. It also would just like stretch out, and the audio quality would deteriorate over time, or it would get caught in the cassette tape decks themselves and the heads that like played it back, and it would get munched. And you know, sometimes it would be so bad it would break off and get caught in the cassette deck, and your cassette would be trash after that, because it, you know, like there's no recovering if you lose a section of the actual tape in the heads. Like the recording is screwed. Another thing that used to happen is like it would get caught in there and get eaten, but you might be able to like pull it out and still listen to the cassette. But always, if your cassette had got munched in a tape deck somewhere, you would hear imperfections in the sound quality from the damaged sections of the tape. So I hate cassettes, I still do. And you know, since they were inevitable back then, you had to either have like the vinyl version or the original copy cassette, and I wasn't going to spend like $15 to $20 for an actual copy of an album on cassette just to have it get munched in a tape deck. So I would just find somebody that had a version of the album, and I'd use a ghetto blaster or a tape deck and just buy those blank cassettes that you could buy at like the dollar store and places like that, to get the majority of my recordings back then. It did suck though, because it meant that you didn't get any of the artwork or anything, but the original copies of cassettes, the artwork is like so small and terrible to begin with that you weren't missing much. The artwork presentation for vinyl is nice and big and awesome though. Anyways, that is Bloodthirst. So continuing on with my story, this will be the last record that I show in this video. The second time I saw them on this touring cycle was with they were with Dimmu Borgir they were touring for like my favorite album by the band, and I got my CD signed, and I smoked some weed with the band and stuff. And I was just so exhausted after the show. I could have hung out with Cannibal Corpse too, but I just wanted to go home at that point. I was tired. And anyways, a fellow dude on TikTok here, my buddy Kurt, he's in Cryophilic, which are a band from the same hometown that we're in. He's also played in Elevator 22, who we shared a rehearsal space with them back in the day, and he was also in Dyed in the Wool. Go sub to his channel. Hey, Kurt.